There's been some recent events or posts, maybe the videos weren't so recent, I'm not sure when some of them were, but when the incident happens, part of the conversation becomes that it's the suspect's fault. And yes, it's the suspect's fault that the event is occurring, but I'm talking about it's the suspect's fault that essentially the officer performed poorly. And I understand that a lot of people are looking at that through a different lens, right? Especially some citizens that maybe support cops or whatever, they say things like that. But the concerning part is that there's officers that also think this way. And essentially what it is, because the circles that I have conversations in and the people that I talk to that are into training and hold themselves accountable and can identify good performances from bad performances, is essentially that this idea that we can pass the blame of poor performances off on suspects is essentially a cop-out. It's a lack of accountability. It's the easy way out. Instead of identifying these poor performances and these weaknesses and then taking accountability and being better for them, we just get to say, when it doesn't go the way that we probably expect it to, well, that's his fault, right? Because, well, I haven't put in the work and I don't plan on putting in the work, so it's just easier to make everybody believe that my performance is his fault. So some examples I've talked about, one is the LA shooting inside of I don't know if it was a mall or a thrift store or a Burlington coat factory actually. And I've talked about it on the podcast before, and the guy was assaulting people with a bike lock, like brutally beating people. I mean, it looked really bad inside the store. Long story short, the officer gets to an aisle where the bad guy is, and I believe the bad guy's probably 12, 15 feet away. I mean, at the end of the aisle, you can't see him at the time. An officer has a rifle and he shoots 3 or 4 times pretty quickly and hits the guy. I think the guy dies, but one of the rounds, they say, ricocheted off the ground and went into the dressing room and killed a 14-year-old girl. And, you know, that's the officer's fault, you know, because what does that come down to? You know, marksmanship, shot placement, decision making. You know, the guy has a bike lock. I don't believe he was in the immediate vicinity of, you know, actively attacking somebody in that very moment. And whether he was or he wasn't, actually, if he was, you'd probably be inclined to shoot less. But, you know, I'm sure there's people there or at that time that look at that and go, oh, well, that's the suspect's fault, which is the wrong way of looking at it. Another video that went around was an officer, I believe LA again, I'm not quite sure. It was a vehicle chase, and the vehicle was slowing, like almost to a stop, I guess, but there was pedestrians in the street and there was a lady crossing the crosswalk, and the cop hit the rear of the suspect vehicle and spun the vehicle around, and the vehicle hit the lady walking across the crosswalk and laid her out. And first of all, like, I don't know, again, what everybody's policies are, tactics, techniques, or whatever, but in the way in which I remember it, which I believe it was just bumper to bumper, is not an approved technique that I'm aware of. So just right off the bat, we're doing something that isn't authorized, wasn't trained, and so it doesn't make sense, right? The other thing is, you know, having the ability to detach yourself from the situation, right? Your physiological responses to stress, you know, the adrenaline's going a little bit. Obviously, the longer we're in that pursuit, the easier it becomes to manage. You know, experience matters, having done it before, but especially in a vehicle pursuit, you know, tunnel vision, you can't just get locked in on this car and what this car is doing, you know, and especially if you're by yourself, you have to pay attention, you know, more closely pay attention to your driving and the things that are going on around you. And especially if it comes down to you making that tactical decision to execute whatever technique, it's not just me and the bad guy and here I go, I'm going to execute this technique. It's does the environment allow me and put me in a position to do this, execute this technique properly? And I believe that there was many other people walking around, not just that lady, which you could argue, well, maybe they didn't see her, but there was other people walking around on the sidewalk, I believe, just past the officers on the crosswalk. And so, you know, there needs to be some personal accountability on the officer's part. There's a difference between illegal conduct and poor performances. And almost never, on average, are cops' actions, you know, as long as they're done in good faith, illegal, right? You know, like, example, did the officer who shot the girl in the dressing room, you know, is that illegal? No. His intent wasn't to do that. You know, did the officer intend, you know, to hit that car into that lady? No. Okay, it's not illegal. Everybody understands that these things aren't illegal, right? But those are two different ways of looking at something. And I think people often look at the legality of a situation and say that it's okay or it's acceptable because it's not fall into the realm of what's illegal. And what is troubling is not citizens that have opinions about performances that support cops and say, yo, it's a suspect's fault. The concern is that there's officers that are thinking the same way. And of a recent incident where somebody else was seriously hurt because of an officer, that's the conversation, that's the public conversation, is that, well, it's the suspect's fault. They brought him into that situation. And that's also the conversation amongst cops who don't care about training and have no desire to train, because it's much easier to just sit around, not really do anything, and then take credit for the event, good or bad, right? And just say, well, it's not my fault they brought them here. But when other cops who don't apply themselves, who don't train, who put other things in their lives at the forefront of training, use that terminology and say, you know, collateral damage, or they brought them there, so that's on them. You're telling everybody that you don't care and that you don't train, because that's not the conversation amongst people that care about these things. And I believe that we're getting farther away from personal accountability when we do those things, when we say those things. And I've said this before, is that the easiest thing that we can do as organizations in a professional way is not pretend like bad things that happen to good people are okay, and that when officers shoot a lot and miss, like, that's a good job. I understand we have to talk a certain way to certain people, but it becomes problematic when we continue to perpetuate to whoever that no matter what your performance is, you know, as long as it isn't illegal or egregious, we're going to make it seem like you did a great job. Like, what does that tell the individual? You should be almost afraid of failure. You should be worried that if you don't perform well, people are going to have a conversation with you about your performance. And I get that we can't train everybody like we should. We can keep trying to, but I understand that time, money, officers off the street, all that. And so if we could ask for anything when perceivably the things we want are out of reach, we could at least start with having the right conversations.